Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see people, and you're not outside doing the tourist bit. I'd like to welcome you to the Clinical Practice Guidelines and Recommendations session, what they need and why we need them. What they are and why we need them. Sorry. So our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Hoffman-Vold from Oslo University Hospital and the University of Hospital Zurich in Switzerland. Anna Maria Hoffman is the head of the Inflammatory and Fibrotic Rheumatic Disease Research Area in Oslo, and she does a lot of collaborative work. I understand she has her own clinic and focuses on research into systemic sclerosis. So I'd like to ask you to go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much to the steering committee for inviting me. And sometimes maybe patients don't understand that this is something very special for us, also being invited here and being able to talk to you about what we have found out, what we are working on together. So this is really an honor to stand here and talk to you, and I hope you have a lot of questions which we can discuss later on. So I just get my presentation up and go. I'm getting help here. Perfect. So I was invited to talk about the ERS-EULA guideline for CTD-ILD, where systemic sclerosis is a subgroup of patients or a subgroup which we analyzed. And I will come back to why I can't really show you a lot of results. And here are my disclosures. And I think because the topic is really to understand why do we need guidelines and what are guidelines. And I think this is tremendously important for patients to understand, because there are a lot of rights in here for you and to spread to other patients what you should request or how you should actually be followed and managed. So this is incredibly important that everyone understands. And you know, when we talk about guidelines, this is really the framework of our care for patients. And you can imagine it's like a navigation tool. It's like a GPS. You put in a goal, and that is a goal to have a good quality of life, to get treated, to get managed the right way. And then the guideline is there to guide you through that goal, together with your treating physician, with your treating healthcare system. And it should be really a structured path. So this is what we work on in all countries, to get a structured path for any disease. But of course, we are working now for systemic sclerosis. But once we have structured path in every country, it's so much easier to come into with a new diagnosis, and you go really from step to step. You get the information you need, you get the treatment you need, you get the management you need. And guidelines are the basis for this. So we need these guidelines for really developing structured paths. And what is very important is it is based on the latest evidence. So a guideline is never what one person or one physician or one nurse or one patient thinks. It's always based on evidence which has been published, which also, of course, tells us how important it is to publish our research, because only then we can develop guidelines. But then, of course, it's also balanced with clinical experience, because not everything has evidence, and there we also need to put into patient preferences, patient wishes, doctors' experiences, everything we have, and merge this together. And it's really there for maximizing success and reducing harm. And how I wanted to say why we need them is I was thinking a lot, how can I actually tell you how important it is to have them? And I came up with, actually, we have learned in the pandemic. And this is something maybe you all remember. I don't know if anyone uses here hydroxychloroquine, but everyone has seen it in the news that time, that it's running out for autoimmune ILD, autoimmune patients, because it came up that it might be a treatment for COVID. And then COVID was prioritized, and these publications came out at that time point. Also, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the New England Journal is a journal which is really the highest evidence for us, like for us, all research is a dream to publish in the New England Journal. But and we take everything very serious which comes out in the New England Journal. But in the pandemic, it was much easier to publish there. So at the end, it was a bit difficult to understand, is that now a good study or not? But at least the New England Journal published that hydroxychloroquine is good for hospitalized patients with COVID. And also the FDA approved it partly for the treatment of COVID. And then we had a very important man in the world at that time point who translated it to everyone take hydroxychloroquine. So if you look on the left side, it was for hospitalized patients with COVID, while he translated it into everyone, let's use it. He even Twittered on it. And he even also went up to saying, well, just use a combination of hydroxychloroquine and antibiotics. But hydroxychloroquine has a much better evidence. Where does that come from? And I mean, having someone in his position, having this, saying this, has a major impact on the world, of course. And then more and more data came out. The EMA, this is the European Medical Agency, so the FDA is for the US and the EMA is for Europe, where we approve therapies, came out and said, well, now there are coming also results that it's maybe harmful. So, and then the whole hydroxychloroquine went down and it was not used. And now, 4 years later, and that is really when we have all the evidence from the pandemic, now it's in the news saying, well, maybe it was even leading to 17,000 deaths in the pandemic. And that was led on evidence where they looked at all different studies and looking at all the results, merged them together and said, yes, it was actually harmful. So this is why we need guidelines. We don't want this to happen to our patients. We don't want to treat anyone with something which can lead to harm and, in the worst case scenario, to death. We need enough evidence to pool data to get certain that this is beneficial and not harmful. So this is why we need guidelines for every single disease, and we could very nicely illustrate it with the pandemic. So back to my other title, it's to present you the ERS-EULA guidelines. And so this is the ERS, is the European Respiratory Society. This is the main society for respiratory pulmonology medicine, lung medicine. And EULA is our rheumatology society, as most of you, of course, know. So we two societies went together and said, okay, let's do a guideline for the management of interstitial lung disease in rheumatic diseases. And I was so lucky to be asked to lead this together with Oliver Distler from EULA, and then we have two very eminent pulmonologists, lung doctors from ERS. So the four of us were leading it. But of course, it's not the four of us, it's a huge panel of experts. And we were all together, the four of us. We had another 3 young doctors in rheumatology and pulmonology. We had 2 patient research partners, and I don't see Ilaria in the room, but who knows the people who know Ilaria? And I asked her whether I was allowed to tell her name. And so she was one of the patient research partner. We also had a research partner from ELF, EUPFF. This is the pulmonology patient organization. Unfortunately, he passed away while we developed the guidelines. Then we had another 7 rheumatologists, 7 lung doctors, 1 pathologist, 1 radiologist, 2 junior methodologists, and 4 methodologists. So you see this is a huge panel of experts who had the oversight of really making that nothing like in the pandemic may happen. And then how did we divide them? And I can also tell you actually upfront that I cannot present you any results. And this is because we are following the rules from the Pulmonology Society, and there it's once until it is published, we are not allowed to tell you results. But for me anyway, the most important is to get you the backbone to understand the guidelines once they will be published, because we will also publish lay summaries for patients, both for rheumatology and pulmonology. So these will be available for all of you, but to understand how you can read and understand them, I think this is still very helpful. So we always start framing questions, and we are framing questions together with the patients. What is important? So which part of the journey do we actually want to answer? And this is structured by specific questions, and they're called PICO. And every letter stands for something. So the P is for the population. So in this case, it is systemic sclerosis patients with interstitial lung disease, with lung fibrosis. The I is an example in a treatment question, a treatment. So let it say it's MMF or cyclophosphamide or rituximab or whatever we chose. The C is the comparator. So we always need to compare to something. And then the O is the outcome. And for the outcome, we defined in the task force together 10 different outcomes and also outcomes which are important for the patients. So it's not only what we physicians think that your lung function should be fine, but also how you feel about symptoms. And that was a very, very important part which was done at the beginning. And then in the next part, we want to answer it with evidence. So once we had defined all the questions, we went and looked in the literature. What is published to answer these questions? And there we use a very strict methodology. And our fellows, they went to thousands of abstracts which were published and saw, does this publication actually answer our question? And the studies which we identify who answered the questions, they were collected. And then these fellows went into the studies and extracted all the data we needed to know for answering all the questions. And after we had done this for every single study, we merged them all together in a standardized way. And then we looked at how certain are we that this data actually answers our questions. And there you get a grading of high, it means we have very high confidence that that is correct. Then moderate, moderate, we think it's okay, low and very low evidence. So every question has a grading of how certain we are that these results answer our question. And then based on this, we extracted everything in a lot of paperwork, and then we had the discussions to formulate recommendations. And there we met, and due to the pandemic, we only met virtually. So we met, I was counting it today, so we met 10 times virtually for phrasing these questions and discussing the evidence, and then we met 30 times every Monday evening between 9 and 11 p.m. because we had people also from the US and Australia. So there we were sitting for hours every Monday evening discussing data and phrasing these guidelines. And here it was very, very important that we had all the different expertise, such as from rheumatology, from pulmonology, from the patient perspective, from the methodologist. So all together we were sitting, discussing the data, giving our input. So what is actually, what do we want? And then at the end, we also included things like resources, availability, equity. So do patients in Asia have the same as patients in Europe? How is this? So we went through all the evidence and classified our evidence and clinical experience. And at the end, and this is something you will see as the result of the guideline. So at the end, we have a recommendation with a direction, and the direction here in green you see is for, and against in red. So it really says the question, do we recommend this? Yes, then it's green. Do we recommend it? No, then it gets red. And then we have a strength. So, and this is either conditional or strong. And this is based on what is the data we have. So in example, the treatment we use in systemic sclerosis is very little approved around the world. We do a lot what we always have done. So the evidence is quite low. And then we need to say, okay, so when we have a study, was that assessed in the total population or only a subgroup of patients? And all this leads to whether we can say it's a strong recommendation, we want every patient on it, or saying, this is conditional, yes, we think it's helpful, but it's more or less for a subgroup of patients, or it's more or less for a specific subgroup, then it quickly turns into conditional. And this is really a major challenge working with orphan diseases such as systemic sclerosis, because the evidence is usually rated as low based on few patients in the trial. If you think of having trials for hypertension or diabetes, where you have thousands of patients per study and you have 10 studies for one outcome, it's very easy to make recommendations. Here, when we have our studies, our medical studies, they have like maybe 300 patients. It's too few. So we already have low evidence. Then we have maximum one study. It's low evidence. So we really struggle, and this is also something we may, as patients and physicians and researchers, go together and write a white paper or something together saying maybe we need a different methodology for orphan diseases because we will never ever fulfill the high needs for getting high evidence. But at least once it is published, you get also these recommendations: for, against, strong, or conditional. And what we covered, and I'm very sorry, but I'm not allowed to, but we covered screening, we covered what to do at time point of diagnosis, we covered monitoring tools, we covered how often patients should be monitored, and we covered treatment. So these questions will be answered once it's published. And why are we so behind? And that is, I think, because we are a quite enthusiastic group. I mean, just getting friends by all these Monday nights, evenings. We identified many lacks and things we needed to discuss. So instead of 4 of the main questions and 8 of the supporting questions, we ended up with 24 questions and 28 supporting questions. So that, of course, makes already clear that it took much longer, and this is why we are way behind our schedule. But it also leads to that it's at the end a much better recommendations once published. And we will make sure that it is translated. They contacted us already. We have already contact with PARE and contact with EU, with ELF, and it will be available in late summer. And maybe we should go together also with FESCA and everything then to get it distributed to all members. Yes, so my take-home messages, guidelines are super important. It's a framework for disease management. And this is our roadmap to work with, both from the patient and from the healthcare professional side. Our ERS EULA, so the respiratory and EULA societies, a guideline will be based on the latest evidence and clinical experience and patient input. It will be available later in 2024. I'm always too optimistic, so I can't say anything because then I would say the summer, but who knows? We will see. But it will be available hopefully very soon. And it's really about maximizing the chance of success and minimizing risk of harm in clinical practice, such as we have seen in the pandemic. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a lot of questions after the next talk so that we can discuss. Thank you very much.
And then we go to Carina Boström. Welcome. She would like to cover the topic non-pharmacological therapies for scleroderma, EULAR recommendations. Carina is an associate professor in Karolinska Institutet, Sweden. Boström has been doing research with rheumatology with focus on systemic sclerosis and systemic lupus erythematosus for many years. She is the leader of the EULAR non-pharmacological treatment of autoimmune connective tissue disease study group. That's a word. She was the convener of a task group that recently developed and published the EULAR recommendation for non-pharmacological management of SLE and scleroderma. Welcome.
So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the newly published and the published EULAR recommendations for non-pharmacological management of SLE and systemic sclerosis, with focus on systemic sclerosis. On the slide, you can see the task force members. The fellow was Yannis Parodis, the first author, and I was the convener, last author. And then in total, there were 25 persons, 3 patients, several rheumatologists, and different kind of health professionals. We started the task force by defining what is non-pharmacological management. And we define it as all management that is not classified as pharmacological by the European Parliament and the European Union. The task force also included dietary substitutes, pre- and probiotics, and fecal microbiota transplants, unless the intervention are pharmaceutical license. And we discussed what is non-pharmacological management and what is the aim and how can we provide it. And for example, we wrote down that the goals include optimization and of body function and structures, increased activities and participation in society, and implementation of favorable environmental and personal factors. Environmental factors could be work and home adjustments, and personal factors could be support to cope with the disease. And we did, as you talked about, a systematic literature review to inform the recommendations. And we have several research questions, and one of them, can you see on the slide, is which intervention have been used and shown to be efficacious. The systematic literature review included 4 databases, and we excluded articles with less than 5 individuals in the results. And we follow standard operation procedure according to EULAR, and the recommendation statements were formulated, discussed, and graded by the task force based on risk of bias assessment, and that is the quality of the separate articles, and then the level of evidence, LOE, articles, and that's also that level of evidence 1 is high evidence articles, and LOE 4 is inconsistent studies. And then we also made a strength of the recommendations, and finally the level of agreement between the task force members, where 0 is complete disagreement and 10 is complete agreement. And 4 overarching principles for the both diseases were formulated, and we wrote that non-pharmacological management should be tailored to patients' needs, expectations, and preferences, and be based on shared decision-making, and may comprise 1 or more non-pharmacological interventions, and may be provided alone or together with pharmacological treatment, and should not substitute pharmacological treatment when the latter is required. And in brackets, you can see the level of agreements, and the means are rather high. You remember that 10 is complete agreement. 5 recommendations were in common for the both diseases. The first recommendation was that non-pharmacological management should be directed towards improving health-related quality of life. And as an example, in systemic sclerosis, it's physical exercise, hand rehabilitation, and occupational therapy. This is something we found in the literature. And the second point is people with SLE and systemic sclerosis should be offered patient education and management support. An example for that in systemic sclerosis is oral exercises and patient education, occupational therapy and patient education, and self-management program. And the third recommendation is that the people with these diseases we should assess smoking habits, and cessation strategies should be implemented. And also avoidance of exposure is something that is recommended for both of the diseases. And finally, exercise should be considered for people with both diseases. Then the separate recommendation for systemic sclerosis was as follows: patient education and self-management support should be considered for improving mouth-related outcomes, hand function, daily activities, and health-related quality of life. Examples for systemic sclerosis are rehabilitation program, physiotherapy educational program, psychoeducational program, etc. And the second point is that different kind of exercises should be considered for improving, for example, microstomia, hand function, and physical capacity. And the final point is that in swollen hands, puffy hands, manual lymph drainage could be considered for improving hand function. We also formulated a research agenda for the future, and as you also told in their talk about the need of randomized controlled trials should be encouraged, and also long-term follow-up of these RCTs. And also further identification of patients' needs should be implemented. And investigation of the efficacy of psychosocial interventions, of skin and wound management, and the efficacy of dietary programs is encouraged. And finally, the identification of barriers for the implementation and the means to lessen them is also warranted. We also formulated an education agenda, both for patients and health professionals. And the first one is that regular training for providers of non-pharmacologic management is advised. The second is that increased awareness and education on how to facilitate and evaluate patient education and self-management should be reinforced. And finally, the educational programs within EULAR dedicated to the non-pharmacological management of people with SLE and systemic sclerosis are advocated. In summary, patient education and self-management and different kinds of exercises should be offered. Smoking habits should be assessed, and cessation strategies should be implemented. Avoidance of cold exposure should be considered for Raynaud's phenomenon. And as I said earlier, more studies are needed concerning skin and wound management, psychosocial interventions, and dietary programs and interventions. Within the EULAR study group of non-pharmacological treatment in autoimmune connective tissue diseases, we are working with this dissemination and implementation of the recommendations with Rita Schremer in lead. And the study group and the steering committee are doing different kinds of activities to disseminate the recommendations. We have 12 national teams, consisting of both patients, health professionals, and rheumatologists and physicians. And you can see the countries on the slide. And we are doing different kinds of natural, transnational activities to disseminate the recommendations. For instance, translation of the recommendation in different languages, both for patient and health professionals. And also, people are doing published articles, posters at congresses, website information, Facebook and Instagram information, all to disseminate the recommendation. And we are inspired by Losa et al. In the implementation of the recommendation. And we are going to do a survey-based investigation of patients and health professionals' perceptions of whether recommendations align with current management practice and their views on facilitators and barriers and how to overcome them. And maybe we might do also the second recommendation for Losa et al. To determine an implementation strategy at the center or national or international level, such as education activities designed for patients and for health professionals, as well as evaluation of this implementation. And here are some references to the first reference is the EULAR recommendations for non-pharmacological management. You can find it in Annals of Rheumatic Diseases. And also the reference under is the systematic literature review informing the EULAR recommendations. And some other articles about these newly published recommendations. This is the first time there is a EULAR recommendation for non-pharmacological treatment in systemic sclerosis and SLE. And here are also some references to other systematic reviews and meta-analysis concerning, for instance, Portuguese recommendation on how to handle Raynaud's phenomenon and digital ulcer, and also a recommendation from the Netherlands, and some other systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Finally, I would like to thank EULAR for funding for developing these recommendations, the task force that did that and developed them, the authors of the systematic review that informed the recommendations, and the EULAR study group. You can find us on the linked address, as you can see on the slide. And also, I would like to thank you, the dissemination and implementation group with Rita in lead for the recommendation project members. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much to both of you. I can't tell you how important recommendations are for systemic sclerosis. You know, it's been a long time coming, and I just have to thank you two for your dedication and involving patients and everybody else. And a plea for any of you, if you are ever asked to join a task force for anything for systemic sclerosis, for recommendations or guidelines, please accept. Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to ask if anyone has any questions. Great. Have we got a microphone? Oh, 2 microphones.
Thank you. Does vitamin D play any role in the recommendations and guidelines?
Which question is that for? Which?
Wherever.
Oh, okay.
For us, it's not, no. So for the treatment, we have really only focused on medical approved therapy, for other indications as well approved. So there will only be medical therapy, which is on our guideline. And for you?
Well, in the systematic literature review, we found articles about D vitamin. Was that the question? But we don't have enough evidence from the literature to take it up in this EULAR recommendation for non-pharmacological management. But there will be within like 3-4 years an update of this recommendation. And maybe there are enough studies concerning D vitamin then. But we saw them, yes, but low evidence, unfortunately.
Okay, how do you deal in general with this problem that there may be aspects that might help and there is some experience about that, but not really medical evidence?
That is a huge problem for all recommendations, but specifically, I think, for the non-pharma one, because so many people will say, this is good for me, but you have to prove it.
And I totally get your question, because often we have questions, there is hints, but there's no evidence. And then we sit there saying, okay, we can't recommend it. So if I would have a patient in front of me asking, I would say, okay, let's measure your vitamin D level and we see whether it's reduced or not. If it's reduced, it's of course treating regular vitamin D. But if it's not, if the question is raising it above what is recommended, then of course there's no evidence. But the thing is, there are a lot of questions which everyone would like to have in a recommendation. But when we see for the medical treatment we are using, how little evidence we have, and I guess you had the same problem in your guideline, is as far away or as further away you come from treatment, like medical treatment, there's less and less evidence. So what I would recommend then always is if someone has a strong belief, try to get someone interested to run a study. And there is more and more interest actually also in non-pharmacological therapy for having trials. And this is what we now have experienced with the guidelines. You really need a study, a single person or a small patient subgroup saying this is interesting. It's not. So that is really the problem.
Yeah. Maybe it would already help if doctors would tell the patients to look into certain aspects that might help to find their own way, and maybe that might be part of the guidelines if it's more or less like no regret strategy.
Yeah. And I think this is why, sorry, I'm asking here, but I think this is also why it's so important to have in every country the contact between patient organizations and researchers mostly, that it often doesn't help with a treating physician. You really need researchers. And if you have in your country, if you are active in a patient organization, I would definitely recommend to find someone in your country who is interested in research, and then you can talk about your topic and then see whether you can design a study. Because it's also, at least in Norway now, it's a requirement that every single project which is applied has a patient on board. So when we apply for national funding for anything, we need and want a patient in this project. And there's a lot of announcement for money or for funding also, which is patient-driven. So if you, and that is often actually easier to get the funding than a pure medical study. So this is also what I recommend everyone. As you said, if you were asked to join in your interest, you have the capacity, you have the wish, get involved, because the patient's voice gets stronger and stronger, and luckily. And it's really, you are there to put the agenda. What do you want us to research on? What do you want us to look for your care at the end? But there we need, of course, also active patients telling us what to do. So I really recommend, in your country, go and find someone, because it will, a lot of people will be thankful.
Basically, you lobby, we as patients, we have to lobby our patient groups, our doctors, anybody who will listen to us, it's up to us. We tell them what is important to us. And it's not easy, but hey, you know, we've got to start somewhere.
And we also have this, as I mentioned, the EULAR study group for non-pharmacological management in connective tissue diseases, and patients are welcome. So Kim is involved in this group and other patients as well. And there we can discuss projects together and, for example, D-vitamin evaluation. So please, welcome.
I would also like to add one thing. I think it's good when you have a group of people to have a minimum of 2 patients. That would be my...
Okay. I like to ask if there's a plan to have like a patient's guideline, which is like the same guideline but in easier words, maybe a little bit shorter for the patients to access the guidelines easier, and to have like a foundation to argue, for example, with their insurances. Is there a plan for that, or?
Yes, for our guideline, we have already been reached out by the 2 patient organizations, one within EULAR, it's called PARE, and the other one for the Lung Society, it's called ELF. They have already contacted us, and we have put the 2 patient associations together, said we want to develop something which is useful for patients from rheumatology and lung side. So yes, there's a definitely yes. And that is exactly what I say, why you need to understand what it means at the end, because you can argue, you can take this piece of paper. If your treating physician is saying you don't need it, you can say, well, it's actually stated in the guideline. I should get it. You can argue for your insurances. This is, of course, always a bit difficult. This is why sometimes we also phrase recommendations not too strong, because it may also be negative for patients at the end. If the insurance says, well, it's not mentioned, you don't get it, right? So it's always a two-sided sword. But we at least, yes, it will be available. And as I understood, that's what you also said, whether it's available in 12 languages or under development.
Under development, yeah.
So yes, and you should log out, and we should work together that we get a distributor to everyone.
I'm pretty sure that everything will be on FESCA's website, you know, when the recommendations will be available on the website.
On EULAR's website, there is already. But
Okay, so
you mean on FESCA?
Can you send them to FESCA?
Yeah, we could have them there, absolutely. Because there is a lay version on the EULAR website, and there will also be information on lifestyle, how you can take care of your own lifestyle when you have systemic sclerosis. There will be examples of exercises and so on in the future, so we are working on that. So, and maybe something on the FESCA website, that would be great.
If there's no more questions, before we wrap up, I've just got a few things to mention. For the people going to, when you leave, can you hand in your headsets, please, and then pick them up tomorrow. People who are attending the dinner tonight, the patient dinner, we are meeting in the foyer of the Holiday Inn at 18:45. You can also make your own way, but if you want to, go in a group, meet at 18:45, 6:45. The restaurant, I know you all know the name of it. It's Candelabra, probably not pronounced properly. And we have some very good news. The Czech session that was going to be in a club room is now going to be here. And if anybody wants to watch it, who speaks English, there will be a translation. It's called Effects of Stress in Autoimmunity. Oh, I can't read my own writing. It's now going to be translated into English. Okay. So, do you want to wrap up?
So if you just stay here, you have another session, interesting, and now in English. And then we want to thank you both for coming, and for we are looking forward to participate with you both. Thank you.